The moment Victoria walked into the mahogany-paneled conference room at Hartwell Associates, she knew her siblings had already planned her portion of their father's estate down to the last penny. Marcus sat at the head of the polished table in his navy banker's suit, papers spread before him like a general planning a campaign, while Stephanie perched beside him in her signature cream-colored blazer, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently against her leather portfolio. They barely glanced up when she entered, their expressions carrying that familiar blend of pity and condescension she'd grown accustomed to over the past decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria settled into the chair across from them, smoothing down her simple black sweater and dark jeans. She'd dressed down deliberately today, knowing exactly what kind of performance her siblings expected from her. The prodigal daughter who'd walked away from the family's pharmaceutical dynasty to chase dreams of environmental activism, only to spend the last 10 years scraping by on nonprofit salaries and idealistic pursuits that never quite paid the bills. Finally, Stephanie sighed without looking up from her phone. We've been waiting for 20 minutes. Some of us have actual businesses to run. Marcus cleared his throat and shuffled through a stack of documents. Victoria, I know this is difficult for all of us, but we need to discuss Dad's assets systematically. The estate is significant, and there are tax implications we need to consider. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd spent 15 years climbing the ranks at Denver's most prestigious investment firm, someone who understood numbers and portfolios and the weight of serious money. Victoria nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Of course, I appreciate you both handling the arrangements. Well, someone had to, Stephanie said, finally setting down her phone. Dad's affairs were more complicated than we initially thought. The pharmaceutical patents alone are worth millions. And then there's the real estate portfolio, the investment accounts, the art collection. She paused, her blue eyes scanning Victoria with barely concealed skepticism. It's not like dividing up Mom's jewelry. Their father, Robert Caldwell, had built Caldwell Pharmaceuticals from nothing, turning a small research lab in suburban Denver into a multi-billion-dollar empire that held patents on 3 of the most widely prescribed medications in North America. Victoria remembered the late nights of her childhood, her father hunched over chemical formulas at the kitchen table, the smell of coffee and determination filling their modest starter home. She remembered when the first major breakthrough came, when the lab coats gave way to designer suits, when their 3-bedroom ranch house became a sprawling estate in Cherry Hills Village. She also remembered the exact moment she'd decided she wanted nothing to do with any of it. Marcus leaned forward, his expression taking on the patient tone he typically reserved for explaining complex financial concepts to his clients. Victoria, I need you to understand something before we proceed. Dad's estate is valued at approximately $2.7 billion. Stephanie's lips curved into a small smile. It's more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. Which is why, Marcus continued, we need to be strategic about this. Stephanie and I have been working with the estate attorneys for weeks now, and we've developed what we think is the most equitable distribution plan. Victoria waited, watching her brother arrange papers with the same meticulous precision their father had once used to organize his research notes. The irony wasn't lost on her that Marcus had inherited their father's attention to detail while rejecting everything else about the man's legacy. Given your situation, Stephanie said carefully, we think it makes sense for you to receive a smaller percentage initially, with the remainder held in trust. That way you'll have financial security without the burden of managing such substantial assets. The situation. Victoria almost smiled at the delicate phrasing. Her situation was that she'd walked away from a guaranteed executive position at Caldwell Pharmaceuticals to spend a decade working for environmental nonprofits, fighting against the very industry that had made her family wealthy. Her situation was that she lived in a small apartment in Boulder, drove a 12-year-old Subaru, and had never earned more than $60,000 in a single year. What kind of percentage are we talking about? Victoria asked. Marcus consulted his papers. We're thinking 5% outright with another 10% accessible through a managed trust. The remaining 85% would be split between Stephanie and myself, given our experience managing large-scale investment and business operations. 15% of a $2.7 billion estate. Victoria did the math quickly, roughly $400 million, more money than she'd ever imagined possessing. It should have felt overwhelming, life-changing, impossible to comprehend. Instead, it felt exactly like what she'd expected from her siblings. 5% seems generous, considering, Stephanie interrupted. Victoria, you haven't spoken to Dad in 3 years. You missed his 70th birthday, his retirement ceremony, even his last Christmas. Marcus and I were the ones taking care of him, managing his medical appointments, handling his business transition. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Victoria thought about the real reason she'd maintained distance from their father, not because she didn't love him, but because every conversation had become a minefield of disappointment and judgment. Robert Caldwell had never understood his youngest daughter's choice to fight against pharmaceutical companies instead of joining the family umpire. He'd seen her environmental work as a personal rejection, her passion for corporate responsibility as a betrayal of everything he'd built. What her siblings didn't know was that their father had understood perfectly well in the end. Dad made his choices about his relationships, Victoria said quietly. I'm not here to relitigate the past. Good, because the future is what matters now. Stephanie's pharmaceutical consulting firm is positioned to acquire several of Dad's smaller patents, which would keep them in the family while maximizing their market value. My investment group has identified opportunities to diversify the portfolio internationally. Stephanie nodded eagerly. We've already had preliminary discussions with 3 major pharmaceutical companies about licensing agreements. The revenue potential is enormous, especially with the new arthritis medication coming to market next quarter. Victoria listened as her siblings outlined their grand plans for multiplying their father's fortune. Marcus spoke about emerging markets and currency hedging strategies. Stephanie described leveraging their father's research data for next-generation drug development. They had charts and projections and 5-year plans that would transform their inheritance into something even larger and more profitable. Neither of them mentioned their father's final years, when his perspective on the pharmaceutical industry had shifted dramatically. Neither referenced the long conversations he'd had with Victoria about corporate responsibility and environmental impact. Neither seemed to know about the private foundation he'd been planning or the scholarships he'd wanted to establish for students studying environmental science.
There is one complication, Marcus said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Dad's will includes some unusual provisions. Apparently, he'd been having conversations with his attorneys about establishing some kind of environmental research foundation. Stephanie waved a hand dismissively. Dad was getting sentimental in his old age. The attorneys confirmed we can challenge those provisions if they interfere with the core estate distribution. Challenge them how? Victoria asked. Undue influence, Marcus explained. Dad's cancer treatments affected his cognitive function toward the end. Any major changes to his estate planning during that period could be contested on the grounds that he wasn't making sound decisions. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. Her father's cancer diagnosis had come 18 months ago, and she'd spent countless hours with him during his treatment. His mind had remained sharp until the very end, sharper perhaps than it had been in years. The chemotherapy had weakened his body but clarified his thinking in ways that had surprised everyone, including his doctors. Dad seemed pretty lucid when I visited him, Victoria said carefully. When was that? Stephanie asked. Because I was there every week, and I can tell you his judgment was definitely compromised. He kept talking about legacy and responsibility and making amends for past mistakes. It wasn't like him at all. It wasn't like the version of him they remembered, Victoria thought, but it had been exactly like the man their father had become in his final months, reflective, thoughtful, determined to use his remaining time to correct what he saw as a lifetime of prioritizing profit over principle. The foundation idea probably came from those environmentalist friends of his. Dr. Patricia Wong from the university was visiting constantly toward the end, filling his head with ideas about corporate accountability and sustainable research. Patricia Wong. Victoria smiled slightly, remembering her father's longtime colleague and friend, a brilliant biochemist who'd spent decades advocating for responsible pharmaceutical development. Patricia had been one of the few people who'd supported Victoria's career choices, and her conversations with Robert Caldwell had apparently been more influential than anyone realized. Anyway, Stephanie said, we can deal with the foundation issue later. The important thing is establishing clear ownership of the primary assets. Marcus has prepared all the paperwork for the trust arrangements. Marcus slid a thick folder across the table. Everything's outlined here. The 5% immediate distribution, the trust setup, the management fees. You'll need to sign in several places. Victoria opened the folder and began reading. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear. Her siblings were offering her a fraction of her father's estate, while positioning themselves as the primary beneficiaries. They'd structured everything to give them maximum control over the inheritance while limiting her access to anything beyond a monthly stipend from the trust. This is very thorough, Victoria said, turning pages slowly. We've been working on it for weeks, Stephanie said proudly. Marcus's legal team helped draft the trust provisions. It's designed to protect you from making any impulsive decisions about the money. Impulsive decisions, like donating to environmental causes, or supporting renewable energy research, or funding the kind of corporate accountability initiatives that might interfere with their pharmaceutical empire expansion plans. I noticed the trust has some restrictions, Victoria observed. Standard provisions, Marcus said. No donations exceeding $50,000 without trustee approval. No investments in organizations that compete or oppose pharmaceutical development. No political contributions to candidates or causes that could be considered hostile to business interests. Essentially, Stephanie added, you'd have financial security without the ability to work against family interests. It's win-win. Victoria continued reading, noting how carefully her siblings had crafted the restrictions. They'd essentially designed a trust that would prevent her from using any inheritance money to support the environmental and accountability work that had defined her adult life. They were offering her wealth in exchange for abandoning her principles. There's also a non-disclosure provision, Marcus pointed out. Given the sensitivity of Dad's pharmaceutical patents and the competitive nature of the industry, we need assurance that proprietary information won't be shared with outside organizations. What kind of outside organizations? Victoria asked. Environmental groups, regulatory agencies, investigative journalists, anyone who might use inside information to damage the company's reputation or market position. Victoria thought about the Environmental Defense Coalition, where she'd spent the last 5 years investigating pharmaceutical waste and regulatory violations. She thought about the groundbreaking report she'd helped publish on the environmental impact of drug manufacturing and the ongoing lawsuit her organization had filed against 3 major pharmaceutical companies for improper waste disposal. Her siblings were asking her to sign away not just her inheritance rights, but her ability to continue the work that gave her life meaning. This is a lot to process, Victoria said, closing the folder. Take your time, Marcus said generously, but we do need to move forward soon. There are estate tax deadlines we need to meet. Stephanie leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. Victoria, I know this seems complicated, but we're trying to take care of you. You've never had to manage serious money before. This way, you'll be financially secure without the stress of investment decisions or business management. The condescension in her sister's voice was gentle but unmistakable. She genuinely believed she was protecting Victoria from responsibilities she couldn't handle. Marcus's expression carried the same patient concern he might show to a financially illiterate client who needed guidance making basic investment decisions. Neither of them could conceive that their environmental activist sister might be capable of understanding complex financial structures or managing substantial assets. Neither could imagine that Victoria might have her own plans for her father's money, plans that aligned with values they'd long since dismissed as naive idealism. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Did either of you ever read Dad's research notes from his final months?" Marcus and Stephanie exchanged glances. "His medical research?" Marcus asked. "His personal notes about the pharmaceutical industry, about corporate responsibility, about what he wanted his legacy to represent." Victoria, Stephanie said patiently, Dad was dying. People get philosophical when they're facing mortality. It doesn't mean his business judgment was sound. Besides, Marcus added, Dad built his fortune by making smart, practical decisions about pharmaceutical development. Whatever he was thinking toward the end, his real legacy is the company he created and the wealth he accumulated. Victoria nodded slowly. Her siblings saw their father's fortune as validation of his life's work. They couldn't understand that Robert Caldwell's final months had been spent questioning whether that validation came at too high a cost. Did you know Dad was working on a comprehensive study of pharmaceutical environmental impact? Victoria asked. He mentions something about sustainability initiatives, Stephanie said dismissively. Every major corporation is doing environmental PR these days. It's good for public relations. This wasn't PR. He was documenting actual environmental damage caused by pharmaceutical manufacturing. He'd identified specific violations at Caldwell facilities going back 20 years. Marcus frowned. That information would be proprietary and confidential. Even if such a study existed, it couldn't be released without board approval. Which is why, Stephanie added pointedly, the non-disclosure provisions in your trust are so important. Dad may have been researching environmental issues, but releasing that information could destroy the company's value. Victoria thought about the thick folder of documents currently locked in her apartment safe. Her father's environmental impact study was more than theoretical research. It was a detailed accounting of regulatory violations, waste disposal shortcuts, and environmental damage that could expose Caldwell Pharmaceuticals to billions in liability. It was also the foundation for the most comprehensive corporate accountability case her organization had ever assembled. I understand your concerns about protecting the company, Victoria said carefully. Good, Marcus said, relaxing slightly. Because at the end of the day, we're all family. Dad's legacy belongs to all of us. Speaking of legacy, Stephanie said, there's something else we need to discuss. Dad's art collection. Victoria waited, knowing this conversation would reveal more about her siblings' true assessment of her worthiness. The collection is valued at approximately $40 million, museum-quality pieces, some dating back centuries. Obviously, proper preservation requires climate-controlled storage and professional security. Obviously, Victoria agreed. Your apartment situation, Stephanie began delicately. My apartment situation? Well, you're renting, aren't you? In Boulder. And it's not exactly spacious. Marcus consulted his papers again. We think it makes sense for the art collection to remain with family members who have appropriate facilities for storage and display. Stephanie's house in Cherry Hills has a dedicated gallery space, and my penthouse downtown has museum-grade security systems. So the art would be split between you two. With access provisions for you, of course, Stephanie said quickly. You could visit the pieces anytime, and we'd rotate exhibitions so you could enjoy the full collection. Victoria almost laughed at the suggestion that she'd need to make appointments to view her father's art in her siblings' homes. The collection included pieces her father had spent decades acquiring, not just for their monetary value, but because they represented philosophical concepts that had guided his thinking. The abstract expressionist paintings that reminded him to think beyond conventional boundaries, the classical sculptures that connected him to timeless principles of beauty and proportion. Her siblings saw dollar signs. Her father saw inspiration. What about Dad's personal effects? His journals, his research notes, his correspondence? Marcus and Stephanie exchanged another look. That's mostly sentimental material, Stephanie said. No real monetary value. We assumed you'd want those items, since you were always interested in Dad's philosophical side. It was a telling distribution. They'd claim the valuable assets while leaving her with the worthless personal items. Except Victoria knew that her father's journals and research notes represented something far more valuable than art or money. They contained the intellectual foundation for his transformation from profit-focused pharmaceutical executive to environmentally conscious advocate for corporate responsibility. They also contained detailed documentation of conversations he had had with lawyers about restructuring his entire estate. "That seems fair," Victoria said.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Excellent, Marcus said, looking relieved. Then we can move forward with the paperwork. Actually, Victoria said, before I sign anything, I'd like to speak with Dad's primary attorney, James Hartwell. Stephanie's expression tightened slightly. That's not necessary. Marcus and I have been working with the estate team for weeks. Everything's been thoroughly reviewed. I'm sure it has, but this is a significant decision, and I'd like to understand all the legal implications before committing. Victoria, Marcus said, his patience beginning to show strain, we've already explained the legal implications. The trust structure is designed to protect your interests while ensuring responsible management of the assets. And I appreciate that, but I'd still like to speak with Mr. Hartwell directly. He's not available today, Stephanie said quickly. He's in court all week. Victoria smiled. That's fine. I can wait. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Marcus shuffled his papers, while Stephanie checked her phone with exaggerated focus. Victoria sat calmly, knowing that every passing moment of delay was making her siblings increasingly anxious about their carefully constructed distribution plan. Look, Marcus finally said, I don't understand your hesitation. This arrangement gives you more money than you've ever dreamed of having. You'll never need to work again if you don't want to. It's not about the money, Victoria said. Then what is it about? Stephanie demanded. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're letting pride interfere with common sense. Pride. Victoria considered the accusation. Was it pride that made her reluctant to accept a fraction of her inheritance while signing away her ability to continue environmental work? Was it pride that made her question her siblings' assumption that she couldn't handle substantial wealth responsibly? Or was it the memory of her father's voice during their last conversation, when he'd told her that he was proud of the woman she'd become, proud of her commitment to principles over profit, proud that at least one of his children had chosen conscience over convenience? Maybe it is pride, Victoria said. Maybe I'm proud of the work I've been doing, and I'm not ready to give it up. You don't have to give up your work, Marcus said. The trust allows for reasonable charitable contributions. You could still support environmental causes within appropriate limits. Define appropriate limits. Well, Stephanie said, nothing that would directly conflict with pharmaceutical industry interests, nothing that would support litigation against chemical companies, nothing that would fund research used to attack business practices. In other words, Victoria thought, nothing that would allow her to continue doing the work that had defined her adult life. Nothing that would honor her father's final transformation or support the causes he'd come to embrace in his last months. I need some time to think, Victoria said, standing up. How much time? Marcus asked. Because the estate deadlines are real, and we can't postpone indefinitely. A few days, a week at most. Stephanie sighed heavily. Victoria, you're overthinking this. Dad left us a fortune, and we're trying to share it responsibly. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Victoria paused at the conference room door. Did Dad ever tell you about his conversation with Patricia Wong about pharmaceutical companies and environmental responsibility? Patricia filled his head with a lot of idealistic nonsense toward the end, Marcus said dismissively. Dad was vulnerable because of the cancer treatments. Did he seem vulnerable when he fired the company's lobbying firm for opposing clean water regulations? He what? Stephanie said sharply. Or when he donated $2 million to the Environmental Defense Coalition for pharmaceutical waste research? Marcus stood up abruptly. That donation went through? We thought the lawyers had blocked it. Victoria smiled. Dad was more determined than you realized, and more lucid. She left them sitting in stunned silence, knowing that her siblings were about to spend considerable time and energy trying to understand exactly how much their father had changed in his final months, and how many of their assumptions about his priorities had been wrong.
What they still didn't know was that Robert Caldwell's transformation had been complete enough to rewrite his entire will 6 months before his death. Victoria drove back to Boulder through the late afternoon traffic, her phone buzzing constantly with calls from Marcus and Stephanie. She ignored them, focusing instead on the mountain views and the familiar sense of calm that came from driving away from her family's world of pharmaceutical wealth and competitive achievement. Her apartment building in Boulder was modest but comfortable, a converted Victorian house that had been divided into 6 units. Victoria's one-bedroom space on the 2nd floor featured hardwood floors, tall windows, and the kind of lived-in comfort that came from function over luxury. The walls were covered with her father's photographs, not the valuable art collection her siblings coveted, but personal pictures that captured moments of family happiness before money and success had complicated everything. Victoria made herself a cup of tea and settled at her small kitchen table with the folder of documents her siblings had prepared. Reading through their trust arrangement again, she was struck by how meticulously they'd planned to control her access to the inheritance while preserving their own freedom to maximize its value. They genuinely believed they were protecting her from financial responsibilities she couldn't handle. They also genuinely believed their father's late-life environmental interests represented a temporary departure from his true values, rather than a deepening understanding of what mattered most. Both beliefs were about to be tested.
Victoria opened her laptop and pulled up the email she'd received 3 days earlier from James Hartwell, her father's primary attorney. The message was brief but clear. Miss Caldwell, per your father's instructions, I need to meet with you privately before any estate distribution discussions with your siblings. Please call my office to schedule an appointment at your earliest convenience. She'd been waiting for Marcus and Stephanie to reveal their distribution plans before meeting with Hartwell. Now she understood exactly what her siblings believed they were entitled to and exactly how they planned to limit her access to both the inheritance and the freedom to use it according to her values. It was time to learn what her father had actually intended. Victoria called Hartwell's office and scheduled an appointment for the following morning. Then she walked to her bedroom closet and removed a large safety deposit box key from its hiding place behind a loose baseboard. The box contained copies of every document her father had shared with her during his final months: research studies, legal correspondence, financial records, and a letter explaining his decision to restructure his entire estate. She'd been carrying the weight of that knowledge for 6 months now, watching her siblings plan their pharmaceutical empire expansion while knowing that their father's true legacy would be something entirely different. Tomorrow morning, James Hartwell would confirm what Victoria already knew. Robert Caldwell had left his entire $2.7 billion estate to his youngest daughter, along with detailed instructions for using that wealth to hold pharmaceutical companies accountable for their environmental impact. Her siblings' meeting today had been nothing more than an elaborate fantasy, a careful plan built on completely false assumptions about their father's final wishes. Victoria finished her tea and watched the sunset behind the Rocky Mountains, thinking about the conversation she'd need to have with Marcus and Stephanie once they learned the truth. They'd spent weeks preparing to control her access to a fraction of their father's wealth, never imagining that she was about to inherit all of it. More importantly, they'd never imagined that their environmental activist sister was about to become one of the most powerful and well-funded corporate accountability advocates in the world. The irony would have made their father smile. His pharmaceutical fortune, built through decades of prioritizing profit over environmental concerns, was about to become the foundation for the most comprehensive investigation of pharmaceutical industry practices ever undertaken. Victoria opened her laptop again and began drafting a message to her colleagues at the Environmental Defense Coalition. Tomorrow, after her meeting with James Hartwell, she'd need to discuss expanding their operations significantly. After all, they were about to have a very well-funded new board member. Victoria arrived at the Hartwell Associates building 45 minutes early, using the extra time to walk through downtown Denver's financial district. The morning air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and the glass towers reflected the early sunlight in patterns that reminded her of the molecular diagrams her father used to sketch during her childhood. She'd always loved this part of the city, the energy of people building and creating and solving problems, even when those problems involved the kind of corporate maneuvering she'd spent her adult life opposing.
James Hartwell's office occupied the entire 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains. Victoria had been here once before, years ago, when her father had insisted she meet the man who'd been handling Caldwell family legal affairs for 3 decades. She remembered feeling intimidated by the mahogany paneling and leather-bound law books, the sense that this was where serious money made serious decisions. Today, she felt different. Today, she knew exactly why she was here. Hartwell's secretary, a poised woman in her 50s, greeted Victoria with the kind of professional warmth that suggested she'd been expecting this meeting for some time. "Miss Caldwell, Mr. Hartwell is ready for you. Can I offer you coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be perfect, thank you." James Hartwell stood as Victoria entered his office, and she was struck by how much he'd aged since their last meeting. The attorney was still imposing at 6'3", but his dark hair had gone completely silver, and his face carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades managing other people's most significant life transitions. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, but tinged with something that might have been sadness. "Victoria, thank you for coming. Please sit wherever you're comfortable." She chose one of the leather chairs facing his desk, accepting the coffee from his secretary and taking a moment to appreciate the view. From this height, Denver spread out below them like a detailed map, the pharmaceutical district where her father had built his empire visible in the distance. "Your father spoke about you constantly during his final months," Hartwell said. "He was incredibly proud of the work you're doing with the Environmental Defense Coalition. I'm glad. We didn't always see eye to eye about my career choices." No, but his perspective changed significantly toward the end. He spent considerable time researching your organization's work, particularly your pharmaceutical waste investigations. Hartwell paused, studying Victoria's face. He was especially impressed by your report on manufacturing violations in the Colorado River watershed. Victoria felt a flutter of surprise. That report had taken her team 18 months to complete, and it had directly implicated 3 major pharmaceutical companies, including Caldwell Pharmaceuticals, in illegal waste disposal practices. She'd never mentioned it to her father, assuming it would only create more tension between them. He read the report? He did more than read it. He spent 2 weeks fact-checking every citation, verifying every claim, reviewing every piece of evidence your team had assembled. Hartwell opened a thick folder on his desk. Then he asked me to arrange a meeting with the Environmental Protection Agency. Victoria set down her coffee cup carefully. A meeting about what? About Caldwell Pharmaceuticals' environmental violations, about the company's legal liability for watershed contamination, about his desire to cooperate fully with any federal investigation into pharmaceutical industry practices. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Victoria's father hadn't just read her report, he'd been prepared to use it as the foundation for exposing his own company's illegal activities. The man who'd built a pharmaceutical empire had been ready to tear it down in service of environmental accountability. "My siblings don't know about this." "Your siblings know very little about your father's activities during his final year," Hartwell replied. "Robert was quite deliberate about keeping certain information confidential until after his death, because he knew they'd try to stop him. Because he knew they wouldn't understand his motivations. Marcus and Stephanie see the pharmaceutical industry as the source of the family's wealth and status. They couldn't comprehend why Robert would want to jeopardize that legacy." Hartwell pulled out a letter bearing her father's distinctive handwriting. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, the kind of stationery Robert Caldwell had used for important correspondence throughout his career. Victoria recognized his careful penmanship immediately, precise, methodical, each letter formed with the same attention to detail he'd brought to chemical formulas. "Your father wrote this letter 6 months before his death," Hartwell said. "He asked me to read it to you before we discussed any legal arrangements." Victoria nodded, her throat suddenly tight. Hartwell adjusted his reading glasses and began. "My dearest Victoria, if James is reading this letter to you, then I'm gone, and you're about to learn some things that will surprise you. I hope they'll also make you proud, though I understand if they don't. I've made many mistakes in my life, but perhaps the biggest was letting you believe that I disapproved of your choices."
"I never disapproved of your values, sweetheart. I was afraid of them. I was afraid that your commitment to environmental protection and corporate accountability would force me to confront the compromises I'd made in building Caldwell Pharmaceuticals. I was afraid that your integrity would highlight my own moral shortcuts. I was afraid that supporting your work would mean acknowledging that my life's work had caused harm. I was wrong to be afraid, and I was wrong to let that fear damage our relationship. Your environmental activism isn't a rejection of the family. It's the fulfillment of everything our family should represent. You chose conscience over profit, principle over convenience, and I should have celebrated that choice instead of resenting it. The pharmaceutical industry has brought tremendous benefits to human health, but it has also caused enormous environmental damage. For too many years, I prioritized the benefits while ignoring the costs. You've spent your adult life trying to balance that equation, and I'm finally ready to help. By the time you hear this letter, I will have restructured my entire estate to support your environmental work. You are inheriting not just money wealth, but my responsibility to use that wealth for something better than profit maximization. I trust you to know what that something better should be. I love you, Victoria. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I'm sorry it took me so long to say so. Hartwell finished reading and set the letter down gently. Victoria wiped tears from her cheeks, overwhelmed by hearing her father's voice one final time, by learning that their relationship had meant more to him than she'd ever understood. "There's more," Hartwell said softly. "Your father spent his final months working with environmental attorneys to establish a comprehensive plan for pharmaceutical industry accountability. He wanted his wealth to fund the largest corporate responsibility investigation in history." "How large?" Hartwell consulted another document. "The estate is valued at $2.7 billion. Robert's instructions are to establish the Caldwell Environmental Accountability Foundation with you as the sole trustee and decision-maker. The foundation's mission is to investigate, expose, and remediate environmental damage caused by pharmaceutical manufacturing." Victoria felt the weight of the revelation settling over her. Her father hadn't just left her his fortune, he'd left her the resources to transform corporate environmental accountability on a scale she'd never imagined possible. What about Marcus and Stephanie? They each received trust funds worth $50 million with no restrictions on their use. Robert felt that was sufficient to ensure their financial security while directing the majority of his wealth toward environmental work. $50 million each. More money than most people could spend in a lifetime, but a tiny fraction of the total estate. Victoria's siblings had spent weeks planning to give her 15% of an inheritance they were never going to receive. They're going to be devastated. They're going to be furious, Hartwell corrected. Robert anticipated their reaction, which is why he insisted on several protective measures. What kind of protective measures? Hartwell pulled out another set of documents. First, the will is ironclad. Robert worked with 3 different law firms to ensure it couldn't be successfully challenged on any grounds. Second, all of Caldwell Pharmaceuticals' environmental violation documentation has been secured and copied. Any attempt to destroy evidence will result in immediate federal investigation. Third, the Environmental Defense Coalition has been granted access to all relevant company records as part of Robert's cooperation agreement with the EPA. Victoria's head spun as she processed the implications. Her father hadn't just decided to support environmental accountability, he'd systematically dismantled any possibility that his pharmaceutical empire could continue operating without full transparency and responsibility. What about the other element? Robert knew that your siblings would likely attempt to contest the will or interfere with the foundation's work. He's established financial incentives for their cooperation. What kind of incentives? If Marcus and Stephanie agree to support the foundation's environmental investigations and refrain from any legal challenges to the will, their trust funds increase to $100 million each. If they actively assist with the accountability process, the trusts increase to $200 million. Victoria almost laughed at the elegant simplicity of her father's strategy. He'd created a system where her siblings' financial interests aligned with environmental accountability rather than opposing it. The more they helped expose pharmaceutical industry violations, the wealthier they became. And if they choose not to cooperate, then they receive the base $50 million and watch as their pharmaceutical industry connections become worthless. Robert documented extensive violations at every major company Marcus and Stephanie have business relationships with. The accountability investigation will proceed with or without their help, but their industry credibility won't survive if they're seen as opposing environmental transparency. Victoria set down her coffee cup and walked to the windows, looking out over the city where she'd grown up, where her father had built his empire, where she'd chosen to fight against everything that empire represented. Now, she was being handed the resources to continue that fight on a scale she'd never imagined possible. When do I need to tell them? The will reading is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Robert insisted that you have 24 hours to process this information before facing your siblings' reactions. What about the foundation? When does it become operational? Immediately upon your acceptance of the inheritance. Robert's attorneys have spent months establishing the legal structure, securing the necessary permits, and identifying potential investigation targets. The Environmental Defense Coalition has already agreed to merge their operations with the foundation, expanding their staff and resources dramatically. Victoria turned back towards Hartwell, thinking about her small apartment in Boulder, her 12-year-old Subaru, her modest nonprofit salary. Tomorrow, she would become one of the richest women in Colorado, with resources to fund environmental investigations that could transform corporate environmental accountability nationwide. There's another element, Hartwell continued, and it's perhaps the most important. Robert established a challenge fund specifically targeting pharmaceutical companies' environmental practices. Any company that achieves independently verified environmental compliance standards within 5 years receives substantial financial incentives. Those that don't face comprehensive legal action funded by the foundation. He created both a stick and a carrot. Exactly. Robert believed that corporate behavior changes fastest when companies see both the costs of noncompliance and the benefits of responsible practices. Victoria returned to her chair, her mind racing with possibilities. The foundation could fund research into sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing. It could support communities affected by chemical contamination. It could establish environmental standards that transformed industry practices worldwide.
I need to ask you something, she said. Yesterday, Marcus and Stephanie presented me with a trust arrangement that would have given me 15% of the estate with severe restrictions on how I could use the money. Did they know the truth about Dad's will? Hartwell's expression darkened. They know that Robert made some changes to his estate planning during his final months, but they don't know the extent of those changes. They've been working under the assumption that the core distribution remained unchanged. So they genuinely believed they were inheriting 85% of the estate? They believed that because Robert allowed them to believe it. He felt that their true priorities would only be revealed if they thought they were in control of the inheritance. Victoria thought about her siblings' careful plans to restrict her access to environmental causes, their assumption that she couldn't handle substantial wealth responsibly, their determination to prevent her from using inheritance money to support corporate accountability work. Dad was testing them. He was allowing them to reveal their values without the influence of knowing they'd already lost control of the estate. Their behavior during the transition period would determine how much additional support they'd receive from the foundation. And yesterday's meeting was exactly the kind of behavior Robert expected. Marcus and Stephanie prioritized their own wealth accumulation over family relationships. They assumed you couldn't handle financial responsibility. They structured arrangements to prevent you from supporting environmental causes. They demonstrated precisely the kind of thinking Robert wanted to move away from. Victoria felt a complex mix of sadness and vindication. Her father had orchestrated an elaborate test of his children's values, and her siblings had failed spectacularly. Their condescending treatment of her during yesterday's meeting hadn't just been personally hurtful, it had been financially catastrophic for them. What happens now? Now you decide whether to accept the inheritance and the responsibilities that come with it. The foundation will require significant time and energy to manage effectively. You'll be overseeing environmental investigations that will make you powerful enemies in the pharmaceutical industry. Your life will change dramatically. Victoria stood and walked to the windows again, watching traffic move through downtown Denver like blood through arteries. Somewhere out there, pharmaceutical companies were making decisions about environmental compliance based on profit calculations rather than ecological impact. Somewhere out there, communities were dealing with contaminated water supplies, while corporate executives justified the contamination as an acceptable cost of business. Her father was offering her the resources to change those calculations permanently. "I accept," she said without turning around. "The inheritance or the foundation responsibilities? Both. All of it. Everything Dad planned." Hartwell smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "He knew you would. Robert told me that of all his children, you were the only one who'd ever chosen principle over profit. He said that made you the only one he trusted with this kind of responsibility." Victoria returned to her chair, suddenly aware that she needed to start thinking differently about her capabilities and resources. Tomorrow, she would become the trustee of a foundation with nearly $3 billion in assets. She would have the power to fund environmental investigations that exposed corporate violations worldwide. She would become one of the most influential voices in corporate accountability. "There's paperwork to complete," Hartwell said, "but nothing that needs to happen today. I'd suggest using the time to think about how you want to handle tomorrow's will reading. Your siblings' reactions are going to be intense. Any advice? Remember that their anger will be about losing control, not about the actual money. $50 million is still a fortune by any reasonable standard. But Marcus and Stephanie have spent their adult lives believing they were entitled to inherit pharmaceutical wealth and continue building the family empire. Learning that the empire is being dismantled for environmental accountability will challenge their fundamental assumptions about their own identities." Victoria nodded, thinking about the careful plans her siblings had made for expanding their pharmaceutical operations, the business relationships they'd cultivated, the future they'd envisioned for themselves as pharmaceutical industry leaders. They'll probably try to contest the will anyway. They'll certainly threaten to. But Robert's legal team anticipated every possible challenge. The will is structured to withstand any conceivable legal attack, and the documentation of pharmaceutical industry violations makes it dangerous for Marcus and Stephanie to pursue litigation that would expose their own business practices. So they'll have to accept it. They'll have to choose between accepting it gracefully and receiving substantial financial compensation, or fighting it and losing everything while watching the accountability investigation proceed without them. Victoria gathered her jacket and purse, her mind already shifting toward the practical challenges of managing a multi-billion-dollar foundation. She would need to expand her staff, establish investigation protocols, develop relationships with environmental agencies, and create systems for managing the largest corporate accountability initiative in history. She would also need to have one of the most difficult conversations of her life with Marcus and Stephanie. "James, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Did Dad ever express any regrets about waiting so long to make these changes?" Hartwell was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "Robert's biggest regret was that he let fear prevent him from supporting your work earlier. He felt that if he'd been braver sooner, you might have been able to work together on environmental accountability instead of you having to fight the pharmaceutical industry alone. Maybe we wouldn't have been ready for that kind of collaboration earlier. Maybe not. But he hoped that this foundation would give you the resources to accomplish everything you dreamed of and more." Victoria left the law office with a manila envelope containing preliminary foundation documents and a head full of plans for transforming corporate environmental accountability. She drove back to Boulder slowly, taking the scenic route through the mountains, using the time to process the magnitude of what she'd just learned. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts from Marcus and Stephanie, but she let them go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to hear their voices until she'd fully absorbed the reality of her new situation. At home, she made lunch and spread the foundation documents across her kitchen table. The legal structure her father had created was sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to maximize impact while minimizing bureaucratic interference. The foundation could fund research, support litigation, establish environmental standards, and provide financial incentives for corporate compliance. Most importantly, it could operate independently of political or economic pressure from pharmaceutical companies.
With nearly $3 billion in assets, the foundation would be wealthy enough to pursue investigations without fear of financial retaliation. Victoria's phone rang again, and this time she recognized the number as Marcus's office line. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to his increasingly frantic messages. "Victoria, we need to talk immediately. Something's wrong with Dad's estate planning. The lawyers are saying there were major changes made in his final months. Call me back as soon as you get this." The next message was from Stephanie. "Victoria, whatever you think you know about Dad's will, we need to discuss it as a family before anyone makes any rash decisions. Marcus thinks there might be legal issues with the recent changes." The final message was from Marcus again, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Victoria, James Hartwell's office confirmed you had a meeting with him this morning. I don't know what he told you, but you need to understand that Dad wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. Any major changes to his estate planning could be challenged successfully. We need to meet tonight to discuss our options." Victoria deleted the messages and turned off her phone. Her siblings were beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with their assumptions about the inheritance, but they still believed they could manage the situation through legal maneuvering and family pressure. Tomorrow, they would learn exactly how wrong they were. Victoria spent the afternoon researching pharmaceutical companies that would likely become investigation targets for the foundation. She reviewed environmental violation reports, identified patterns of noncompliance, and began developing prioritization criteria for accountability initiatives. The scale of potential impact was staggering. With proper funding and legal support, the foundation could expose environmental violations that had been hidden for decades. It could force industry-wide changes in manufacturing practices. It could establish precedents for corporate accountability that transformed how pharmaceutical companies approached environmental responsibility. By evening, Victoria had filled 3 legal pads with notes and ideas for foundation operations. She felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced since beginning her environmental work years earlier. For the first time, she had the resources to pursue corporate accountability without worrying about funding limitations or industry retaliation. Her phone had been buzzing all afternoon with continued calls from Marcus and Stephanie, but she'd left it turned off. She would face their reactions tomorrow, after the official will reading, when there would be no possibility of preventing or delaying the truth. Tonight, she wanted to savor the knowledge that her father had trusted her with the most important decision of his life. He'd chosen environmental accountability over pharmaceutical profits, principle over convenience, conscience over wealth accumulation. He'd also chosen her over her siblings as the person most capable of using his fortune responsibly. Victoria made dinner and sat by her window watching the sunset over the Rocky Mountains, thinking about the conversation she'd had with her father during his final hospitalization. She'd visited him every week during his cancer treatment, and their relationship had slowly transformed from polite distance to genuine connection. During one particularly difficult evening when his pain medication had made him philosophical, he'd asked her about her environmental work with an intensity that had surprised her. "Tell me about the pharmaceutical companies you're investigating," he'd said. "Tell me exactly what they're doing wrong." She'd hesitated, not wanting to upset him by criticizing his industry during his illness. But he'd insisted, and she'd found herself describing the waste disposal violations, the regulatory shortcuts, the environmental damage that pharmaceutical manufacturing had caused to watersheds and communities worldwide. Instead of defending the industry, her father had listened with growing concern and asked increasingly detailed questions. He'd wanted to know about specific companies, particular violations, the evidence her organization had assembled.
Sweetheart, he'd said finally, what would it take to fix this? What would it cost to force pharmaceutical companies to operate responsibly? Billions of dollars and decades of legal work, she'd answered honestly. The industry has enormous resources and political influence. Changing their behavior would require sustained pressure and significant financial backing. He'd nodded thoughtfully and changed the subject to her childhood memories and family stories. She'd assumed his questions about environmental accountability had been casual interest, a father trying to understand his daughter's career. Now she realized he'd been conducting due diligence for the most important business decision of his life. Victoria finished dinner and reviewed the foundation documents one final time, preparing for tomorrow's will reading and her siblings' inevitable reactions. Marcus and Stephanie would be shocked, angry, and probably desperate to find some way to reverse their father's decision. But the legal protections were comprehensive, the documentation was thorough, and the environmental accountability investigation would proceed regardless of their cooperation. Her father had given her everything she needed to transform corporate responsibility on a scale that would honor his memory and fulfill her professional mission. Tomorrow, she would officially become one of the most powerful environmental advocates in the world. Tonight, she fell asleep thinking about all the pharmaceutical executives who had no idea their corporate violations were about to be exposed by a $2.7 billion accountability investigation. The Hartwell Associates conference room felt different when Victoria arrived at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. The same mahogany table dominated the space, the same floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of downtown Denver, but the energy had shifted dramatically. Marcus sat rigidly upright in his tailored charcoal suit, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, while Stephanie perched on the edge of her chair like a cat preparing to pounce. Both of them had been trying to reach Victoria since dawn, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that she'd ignored while spending the morning reviewing foundation documents and researching environmental litigation strategies. James Hartwell entered the conference room carrying a leather portfolio thick enough to contain a small novel. His expression was professionally neutral, but Victoria caught a flicker of something that might have been anticipation in his eyes. Behind him walked Patricia Wong, the biochemist who'd become her father's closest advisor during his final months, and David Chen, a partner from Environmental Legal Associates who specialized in corporate accountability cases. "Thank you all for coming," Hartwell said, settling at the head of the table. "I know this has been a difficult time for the family, and I appreciate your patience as we work through Robert's final wishes." Marcus leaned forward aggressively. "James, before we begin, I need to understand exactly what changes Dad made to his estate planning during his illness. My sources are telling me there were significant modifications that weren't properly disclosed to the family." "Your sources?" Hartwell asked mildly. "I have relationships with estate attorneys throughout the city. Word gets around when someone of Dad's wealth makes major changes to their will." Stephanie nodded emphatically. "We're hearing rumors about environmental foundations and charitable distributions that don't make any sense. Dad built a pharmaceutical empire. His legacy should honor that achievement, not undermine it." Victoria remained silent, watching her siblings attempt to control a situation they didn't yet understand. Their confidence was impressive, considering they were about to learn that every assumption they'd made about their inheritance was completely wrong. "Before we review Robert's final will," Hartwell said, "I think it's important for everyone to understand the context in which these decisions were made. Dr. Wong, would you share your perspective on Robert's state of mind during his final months?" Patricia Wong was a small woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of intense intelligence that made people lean forward when she spoke. She'd been Robert Caldwell's colleague for 30 years, had co-authored several groundbreaking research papers with him, and had watched his transformation from profit-focused executive to environmental advocate with growing admiration. Robert's cancer diagnosis forced him to confront some difficult truths about his life's work, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spent decades in academic research. He began asking questions about the environmental impact of pharmaceutical manufacturing, questions he'd avoided for most of his career.
Marcus interrupted. Dad was under enormous emotional stress. Cancer patients often experience depression and anxiety that affects their judgment. Robert's judgment was never clearer, Patricia said firmly. He spent months reviewing environmental impact studies, consulting with regulatory experts, and analyzing pharmaceutical industry practices. His decision to restructure his estate wasn't emotional. It was the result of careful research and deliberate ethical reasoning. Ethical reasoning about what? Stephanie demanded.
David Chen opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. About Caldwell Pharmaceuticals' environmental violations and the pharmaceutical industry's systematic disregard for environmental regulations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus and Stephanie exchanged glances that mixed confusion with the first hints of genuine alarm. "What violations?" Marcus asked. "Over the past 20 years," Chen continued, "Caldwell Pharmaceuticals has accumulated 47 documented environmental violations, including illegal discharge of chemical waste into the Colorado River watershed, improper disposal of pharmaceutical byproducts, and systematic underreporting of toxic emissions." Stephanie's face went pale. "That's impossible! Dad would never have allowed—" "Your father was unaware of most violations until his final year," Patricia interrupted. "The company's environmental compliance department had been covering up violations and paying regulatory fines quietly to avoid drawing attention to systematic problems. When Robert learned the extent of the environmental damage his company had caused," Chen added, "he made the decision to cooperate fully with federal environmental investigations and to use his personal wealth to fund comprehensive accountability initiatives." Victoria watched her siblings process this information with growing horror. Marcus was a financial analyst who understood liability exposure, and Stephanie ran a pharmaceutical consulting firm that depended on industry relationships. Both of them were beginning to realize that their father's environmental accountability efforts could destroy their professional futures. "This is insane!" Marcus said, his voice rising. "Dad built one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in North America. His legacy should be about medical innovation and business achievement, not some misguided environmental crusade." "Robert's legacy will be determined by how his wealth is used after his death," Hartwell said calmly. "Which brings us to the will reading." He opened his leather portfolio and removed a document bound in dark blue covers. The pages were thick and official-looking, bearing multiple seals and signatures that testified to months of careful legal preparation. "The last will and testament of Robert James Caldwell," Hartwell began, "executed on March 15th of this year, 6 months before his death." March 15th. Victoria remembered that date clearly. It was 3 days after her father had finished reading her environmental impact report on pharmaceutical manufacturing violations. 3 days after their long conversation about corporate accountability and environmental responsibility. 3 days after he'd asked her what it would take to force pharmaceutical companies to operate ethically. After providing for funeral expenses and settling outstanding debts, Robert's will contains the following distributions. To his son, Marcus James Caldwell, the sum of $50 million, to be held in trust with quarterly distributions beginning immediately upon acceptance of this will. Marcus blinked hard, his financial analyst brain processing the number. $50 million was substantial wealth by any measure, but it represented less than 2% of their father's total estate. The math was starting to tell a story that Marcus clearly didn't want to believe. To his daughter, Stephanie Marie Caldwell, the sum of $50 million, to be held in trust with quarterly distributions beginning immediately upon acceptance of this will. Stephanie's designer handbag slipped from her lap and hit the floor with a sound like breaking glass. $100 million total for both siblings, leaving more than $2.5 billion unaccounted for. The remainder of Robert's estate, including all financial assets, real estate holdings, intellectual property rights, and business interests, totaling approximately $2.7 billion, is bequeathed to his daughter Victoria Elizabeth Caldwell to be used for the establishment and operation of the Caldwell Environmental Accountability Foundation. The silence that followed was so complete that Victoria could hear the air conditioning system cycling through the building's ventilation. Marcus sat frozen like a statue, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on Hartwell, with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a traffic accident. Stephanie made a small choking sound and pressed her hand to her throat as if she couldn't breathe properly. "That can't be right," Marcus said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The will is quite clear," Hartwell replied. "Victoria inherits the vast majority of your father's wealth with the specific mandate to use those resources for environmental accountability initiatives targeting the pharmaceutical industry." $2.7 billion? Stephanie gasped. To Victoria for environmental activism? The foundation will investigate pharmaceutical companies' environmental violations, fund remediation efforts for communities affected by chemical contamination, and establish new standards for sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backwards into the window. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "Dad built one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in North America. His legacy should be about medical innovation and business achievement, not some misguided environmental crusade." "Robert's legacy will be determined by how his wealth is used after his death," Hartwell said calmly, which brings us to the will reading. He opened his leather portfolio and removed a document bound in dark blue covers. The pages were thick and official-looking, bearing multiple seals and signatures that testified to months of careful legal preparation. "The last will and testament of Robert James Caldwell," Hartwell began, "executed on March 15th of this year, 6 months before his death." March 15th. Victoria remembered that date clearly. It was 3 days after her father had finished reading her environmental impact report on pharmaceutical manufacturing violations. 3 days after their long conversation about corporate accountability and environmental responsibility. 3 days after he'd asked her what it would take to force pharmaceutical companies to operate ethically. After providing for funeral expenses and settling outstanding debts, Robert's will contains the following distributions. To his son, Marcus James Caldwell, the sum of $50 million, to be held in trust with quarterly distributions beginning immediately upon acceptance of this will. Marcus blinked hard, his financial analyst brain processing the number. $50 million was substantial wealth by any measure, but it represented less than 2% of their father's total estate. The math was starting to tell a story that Marcus clearly didn't want to believe. To his daughter, Stephanie Marie Caldwell, the sum of $50 million, to be held in trust with quarterly distributions beginning immediately upon acceptance of this will. Stephanie's designer handbag slipped from her lap and hit the floor with a sound like breaking glass. $100 million total for both siblings, leaving more than $2.5 billion unaccounted for. The remainder of Robert's estate, including all financial assets, real estate holdings, intellectual property rights, and business interests, totaling approximately $2.7 billion, is bequeathed to his daughter Victoria Elizabeth Caldwell to be used for the establishment and operation of the Caldwell Environmental Accountability Foundation. The silence that followed was so complete that Victoria could hear the air conditioning system cycling through the building's ventilation. Marcus sat frozen like a statue, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on Hartwell, with the expression of someone who just witnessed a traffic accident. Stephanie made a small choking sound and pressed her hand to her throat as if she couldn't breathe properly. "That can't be right," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The will is quite clear," Hartwell replied. "Victoria inherits the vast majority of your father's wealth with the specific mandate to use those resources for environmental accountability initiatives targeting the pharmaceutical industry." $2.7 billion? Stephanie gasped. To Victoria? For environmental activism? The foundation will investigate pharmaceutical companies' environmental violations, fund remediation efforts for communities affected by chemical contamination, and establish new standards for sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair rolling backwards into the window. "This is insane," he said. "Dad built one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in North America. His legacy should be about medical innovation and business achievement, not some misguided environmental crusade. Robert's legacy will be determined by how his wealth is used after his death," Hartwell said calmly, which brings us to the will reading. He opened his leather portfolio and removed a document bound in dark blue covers. The pages were thick and official-looking, bearing multiple seals and signatures that testified to months of careful legal preparation. "The last will and testament of Robert James Caldwell," Hartwell began, "executed on March 15th of this year, 6 months before his death." March 15th. Victoria remembered that date clearly. It was 3 days after her father had finished reading her environmental impact report on pharmaceutical manufacturing violations.
3 days after their long conversation about corporate accountability and environmental responsibility.
The legal structure is designed to withstand any conceivable challenge. Furthermore, Hartwell added, Robert anticipated potential challenges and established additional protective measures. Any attempt to contest this will trigger immediate release of Caldwell Pharmaceuticals' environmental violation documentation to federal regulators and investigative journalists. Marcus sat down heavily, his face ashen. He's destroying the company out of spite. He's accepting responsibility for environmental damage and ensuring it doesn't continue, Patricia Wong corrected. Robert spent his final months documenting every regulatory violation, every environmental shortcut, every instance where Caldwell Pharmaceuticals prioritized profit over ecological protection. The documentation is comprehensive enough to support federal criminal charges, Chen added. Your father's cooperation with environmental investigators is the only reason the company hasn't already faced indictment. Victoria watched her siblings absorb the magnitude of their situation. Their father hadn't just redistributed his wealth, he'd systematically dismantled the pharmaceutical empire they'd expected to inherit while establishing legal protections that made any challenge impossible. There is one additional provision, Hartwell said. Robert understood that this distribution might create family tension, so he established incentive structures for cooperation with the Foundation's environmental work. What kind of incentives? Stephanie asked weakly. If Marcus and Stephanie agree to support the Foundation's investigations and refrain from any legal challenges, their trust funds double to $100 million each. If they actively assist with environmental accountability efforts, the trusts increase to $200 million each. Victoria felt a flicker of admiration for her father's strategic thinking. He'd created financial incentives that made cooperation with environmental accountability more profitable than opposition to it. And if we refuse, Marcus asked, then you receive the base $50 million and watch as the Foundation's investigations expose every pharmaceutical company you've ever had business relationships with, Chen replied. Your industry connections will become worthless when your clients are facing federal environmental charges. The room fell silent again as Marcus and Stephanie contemplated their impossible situation. They could cooperate with environmental investigations that would destroy the pharmaceutical industry careers they'd spent decades building, or they could oppose those investigations and face financial and professional ruin. This is extortion, Stephanie said bitterly. This is environmental accountability, Victoria corrected. Dad realized that pharmaceutical companies only change their behavior when the costs of non-compliance exceed the costs of environmental responsibility. What exactly do you want from us? Marcus asked, his voice hollow with defeat. David Chen opened another folder. The Foundation needs documentation of pharmaceutical industry practices from industry insiders. Marcus's investment firm has access to financial records that could expose environmental cost-cutting measures. Stephanie's consulting company has relationships with pharmaceutical executives who've made decisions about environmental compliance. You want us to become informants against our own industry? Stephanie said. We want you to help expose environmental violations that have been hidden from public scrutiny for decades, Victoria replied. Companies that operate responsibly have nothing to fear from environmental accountability. Companies that don't deserve to face consequences. Marcus was studying the Foundation documents with the focused intensity of someone trying to find escape routes from a burning building. What happens to Caldwell Pharmaceuticals? The company will be restructured to meet the highest environmental standards in the industry, Patricia Wong explained. Robert established a detailed transition plan that prioritizes environmental compliance while maintaining pharmaceutical research and development capabilities. Who's going to run the company during this transition? I am, Victoria said simply. The revelation hit her siblings like a physical blow. Marcus actually recoiled in his chair, while Stephanie made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. You? Stephanie gasped. You're going to run Dad's pharmaceutical company? You don't know anything about pharmaceutical manufacturing. I know everything about pharmaceutical environmental violations, Victoria replied. And I have access to environmental scientists, regulatory experts, and sustainability consultants who can help restructure the company's operations to meet the highest ecological standards. "You'll destroy everything Dad built," Marcus said desperately. "I'll transform everything Dad built into something he could be proud of," Victoria corrected. "The pharmaceutical industry needs to prove that medical innovation and environmental responsibility aren't mutually exclusive." Hartwell cleared his throat. Robert also established specific timelines for these transitions. The foundation becomes operational immediately upon Victoria's acceptance of the inheritance. Caldwell Pharmaceuticals' environmental compliance restructuring begins within 60 days. The broader pharmaceutical industry accountability investigation launches within 6 months. 6 months? Stephanie said faintly. To investigate the entire pharmaceutical industry? The foundation will have nearly $3 billion in resources and access to decades of environmental violation documentation, Chen explained. "We're not starting from scratch. We're expanding existing investigations that Robert was already supporting through his cooperation with federal agencies." Victoria felt the weight of responsibility settling over her like a heavy coat. In 6 months, she would be overseeing environmental accountability investigations that could transform corporate behavior across multiple industries. She would have the resources to pursue justice for communities affected by pharmaceutical contamination while establishing new standards for sustainable manufacturing. "There's something else you should know," Victoria said, looking directly at her siblings. "Yesterday's meeting wasn't just about estate distribution. It was about testing your priorities when you thought you had control over Dad's wealth." "Testing us how?" Marcus asked. "You offered me 15% of the inheritance with restrictions designed to prevent me from supporting environmental causes. You assumed I couldn't handle financial responsibility. You structured arrangements to preserve pharmaceutical interests over family relationships." Victoria paused, letting the implications sink in. "Dad wanted to know how you'd treat me if you had power over my access to inheritance money." "So this whole thing was a setup," Stephanie said bitterly. "This whole thing was an opportunity for you to demonstrate your values," Victoria replied. "You could have offered equal distribution. You could have respected my environmental work. You could have prioritized family relationships over pharmaceutical industry profits. Instead," Marcus said slowly, "we proved that we'd use inheritance money to preserve industry connections and prevent environmental accountability. You proved that Dad was right to restructure his estate the way he did." The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of Denver traffic 40 floors below. Marcus stared out the windows at the city skyline, where pharmaceutical company logos dotted the landscape like territorial markers. Stephanie sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her expression cycling between shock and resignation. "What happens if we choose not to cooperate?" Stephanie asked finally. "You receive $50 million each and complete independence to pursue whatever careers you want," Hartwell replied. "The Foundation's investigations proceed without your involvement, and you bear no responsibility for the accountability process." "But our pharmaceutical industry relationships are destroyed," Marcus added. "Your pharmaceutical industry relationships are based on companies that have been systematically violating environmental regulations," Chen pointed out. "Those relationships were always temporary, whether you knew it or not." Victoria stood and walked to the windows, looking down at the city where she'd grown up believing that business success and environmental responsibility were incompatible goals. Her father had spent his career building pharmaceutical wealth through practices that damaged ecological systems. She'd spent her career fighting against those practices with limited resources and minimal impact. Now she had the opportunity to prove that pharmaceutical innovation and environmental accountability could not only coexist, but could mutually strengthen each other. "I need to know your decisions," Victoria said, turning back toward her siblings. "The Foundation launches next week, and I need to understand whether you'll be part of the solution or obstacles to overcome." Marcus was silent for a long moment, his financial analyst mind clearly running calculations about career options and long-term wealth accumulation. "If we cooperate fully with the environmental investigations, our trust funds increase to $200 million each?" "Correct," Hartwell confirmed. "And if we don't cooperate, we receive $50 million each while watching our industry connections become worthless?" "Also correct." Stephanie laughed bitterly. "So we can choose between being wealthy whistleblowers or moderately wealthy outcasts." You can choose between being part of the largest environmental accountability initiative in corporate history or being bystanders while that initiative proceeds without you, Victoria said. The investigation will happen regardless of your participation. The question is whether you want to help shape it or let it shape you. Marcus stood and joined Victoria at the windows, both of them looking out over the Denver skyline in silence. After several minutes, he spoke without turning around. The pharmaceutical industry has been cutting environmental corners for decades, he admitted quietly. My investment firm has seen financial reports that document regulatory violations and cleanup costs that companies treat as routine business expenses. You have access to that documentation? Chen asked. I have access to financial records that could expose every major pharmaceutical company's environmental practices, Marcus confirmed. Most of them are hiding regulatory violations and contamination liabilities that would shock their shareholders. Stephanie was studying her hands with the expression of someone contemplating a fundamental life change. My consulting firm has relationships with pharmaceutical executives who've made decisions about environmental compliance based purely on cost-benefit analysis. They've chosen regulatory violations over environmental protection because the fines were cheaper than the compliance. You could provide testimony about those decisions? Victoria asked. I could provide detailed documentation about pharmaceutical industry environmental practices that would support federal criminal charges, Stephanie said, but it would end my career as a pharmaceutical consultant. It would end your career as an enabler of environmental violations, Patricia Wong corrected. It could begin your career as an advocate for sustainable pharmaceutical development. Victoria returned to her chair, feeling the conversation reach a critical decision point. Her siblings were beginning to understand that their father's environmental accountability initiative wasn't a temporary disruption to pharmaceutical industry business as usual. It was a permanent transformation that would change how pharmaceutical companies operated. I need decisions today, Victoria said. The foundation board meets tomorrow morning, and I need to know whether you'll be part of our environmental accountability efforts or pursuing independent paths. Marcus turned from the windows, his expression suggesting he'd reached some internal resolution. If I provide the foundation with financial documentation that exposes pharmaceutical industry environmental violations, what protections do I have from industry retaliation? The foundation will have legal resources to protect whistleblowers and sufficient financial backing to ensure your security. More importantly, you'll be part of an initiative that transforms industry practices rather than simply exposing individual companies. What about new career opportunities? Stephanie asked. If my pharmaceutical consulting business becomes obsolete, what alternatives exist? The foundation will need experts in pharmaceutical operations to help design sustainable manufacturing standards, Patricia Wong explained. Your industry knowledge would be invaluable for developing compliance protocols that companies can actually implement. Victoria felt a spark of hope that her siblings might choose cooperation over resistance. Their questions suggested they were moving beyond shock and anger toward practical consideration of their options. There's something else, Victoria added. Dad's environmental accountability initiative isn't just about exposing past violations. It's about creating incentives for pharmaceutical companies to develop sustainable practices that benefit both public health and ecological systems. How does that work? Marcus asked. The foundation will establish certification programs for environmentally responsible pharmaceutical manufacturing. Companies that meet sustainability standards receive financial incentives, research partnerships, and preferred regulatory treatment. Companies that don't face comprehensive legal action and public exposure of their environmental practices. David Chen smiled approvingly. Your father called it the carrot and stick approach. Environmental responsibility becomes more profitable than environmental violations. So pharmaceutical companies have financial incentives to change their behavior, Stephanie said thoughtfully. Exactly, and industry experts who help companies achieve environmental compliance become valuable consultants instead of enablers of violations. The room was quiet again as Marcus and Stephanie processed the implications of transformation rather than destruction. Victoria's foundation wouldn't simply attack pharmaceutical companies. It would provide pathways for those companies to reform their practices while maintaining profitability. I want to see the specific compliance standards, Marcus said finally. If I'm going to help expose environmental violations, I need to understand what sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing actually looks like. Patricia Wong opened her briefcase and removed a thick binder.
Robert spent months working with environmental scientists to develop comprehensive sustainability protocols for pharmaceutical operations. These standards address everything from waste disposal to energy consumption to chemical sourcing.
Marcus accepted the binder and began reading with the focused attention of someone evaluating a complex investment opportunity. After several minutes, he looked up with surprise. "These standards are actually achievable," he said. "Expensive to implement, but achievable. And some of them would probably reduce long-term operational costs." "That was Robert's goal," Patricia explained. "Environmental responsibility that strengthens rather than weakens pharmaceutical companies' financial performance." Stephanie leaned forward with interest. "Can I see the compliance certification requirements?" Patricia handed her another document. "Companies that achieve full environmental certification receive research grants, regulatory fast-tracking, and public recognition as industry leaders in sustainable pharmaceutical development." "This isn't punishment," Stephanie said with growing understanding. "This is transformation." "This is evolution," Victoria corrected. Dad realized that the pharmaceutical industry's environmental practices were unsustainable in the long term. He decided to fund the transition to sustainability, rather than waiting for regulatory agencies or market forces to force that transition. Marcus was still reading through the compliance standards with the expression of someone discovering unexpected opportunities. These sustainability protocols could actually give pharmaceutical companies competitive advantages in international markets. European and Asian regulatory agencies are already moving towards stricter environmental requirements. So companies that achieve compliance early gain market position, Stephanie added, studying the certification requirements. This could be profitable for pharmaceutical companies instead of punitive. Victoria felt relief wash over her as her siblings began to understand their father's vision. The Environmental Accountability Initiative wasn't an attack on pharmaceutical innovation. It was an evolution towards sustainable pharmaceutical development that protected both public health and ecological systems. "Are you interested in being part of this transformation?" Victoria asked. Marcus closed the compliance standards binder and looked directly at his sister. "I want to help expose pharmaceutical companies that are hiding environmental violations, and I want to help design financial incentives that make environmental compliance more profitable than regulatory violations. I want to help pharmaceutical companies achieve sustainability standards that transform their operations and set new industry benchmarks for environmental responsibility," Stephanie added. "And I want to use my industry relationships to support companies that choose environmental responsibility over cost-cutting." Victoria smiled for the first time since the will reading had begun. "Then we're going to work together on the largest environmental accountability initiative in corporate history." Hartwell began arranging paperwork for the trust distributions and foundation establishment. "I'll need signatures on several documents to formalize these arrangements." "James," Victoria said, "can you also prepare employment contracts for Marcus and Stephanie as senior advisors to the foundation?" "Employment contracts?" Stephanie asked. $200 million trust funds and senior advisory positions with the foundation," Victoria explained. "You'll help design environmental compliance standards, support pharmaceutical companies through sustainability transitions, and ensure that environmental accountability strengthens rather than weakens medical innovation." Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the career implications. "I'd be leaving investment banking to work on environmental compliance?" "You'd be leaving traditional investment banking to pioneer sustainable pharmaceutical financing," Victoria corrected. "The foundation will need sophisticated financial structures to incentivize environmental compliance while supporting continued research and development. That's actually more challenging and potentially more profitable than conventional pharmaceutical investment," Marcus admitted. "And I'd be leaving pharmaceutical consulting to work on sustainability protocols?" Stephanie asked.
You'd be transforming pharmaceutical consulting to focus on environmental responsibility instead of regulatory avoidance, Victoria replied. Companies will need expert guidance to achieve compliance standards, and your industry knowledge would be invaluable for designing achievable sustainability requirements. David Chan was taking notes rapidly. The foundation will need both financial expertise and industry knowledge to succeed. Your siblings' participation would significantly strengthen the initiative's effectiveness. Victoria felt the family dynamic shifting in real time. Yesterday, Marcus and Stephanie saw her as the unsuccessful sibling who needed financial protection and behavioral restrictions. Today, they were beginning to understand that she was offering them opportunities to transform their careers while advancing environmental accountability. There's one more thing, Victoria said. The Foundation's headquarters will be located in the Meridian Tower, 15 floors above this conference room. We'll be working together every day, designing the future of sustainable pharmaceutical development. Together? Stephanie asked. As family, Victoria confirmed. Dad wanted his wealth to bring us together around shared values instead of dividing us through competition for resources. Marcus stood and extended his hand toward Victoria. I want to be part of the Foundation's environmental accountability work. I want to help prove that pharmaceutical innovation and ecological responsibility can strengthen each other. Victoria shook his hand, feeling years of family tension dissolving into shared purpose. Welcome to the Caldwell Environmental Accountability Foundation, Senior Financial Advisor. Stephanie joined them, her expression mixing determination with excitement. I want to help pharmaceutical companies achieve sustainability standards that transform their operations and set new industry benchmarks for environmental responsibility. Welcome to the Foundation, Senior Industry Relations Advisor, Victoria said, embracing her sister for the first time in years. Patricia Wong was smiling broadly. Robert would be so proud. He dreamed of his children working together on environmental accountability instead of competing for pharmaceutical wealth. Hartwell began arranging paperwork for trust agreements and employment contracts. This foundation is going to transform corporate environmental accountability nationwide. Victoria looked around the conference room at her siblings, her father's environmental advisor, and the legal team that would support the largest corporate accountability initiative in history. 6 months ago, she was a nonprofit environmental activist with limited resources and minimal industry influence. Today, she was the trustee of nearly $3 billion foundation with the power to transform pharmaceutical industry practices worldwide. When do we start? Marcus asked. We start tomorrow. The Foundation Board meets at 9 a.m. to approve our first round of environmental investigations. Which companies are we targeting?
David Chen smiled grimly. Every pharmaceutical company that has systematically violated environmental regulations while hiding those violations from shareholders and regulators. How many companies is that? Marcus asked. Based on Robert's documentation and our preliminary research, Chen replied, approximately 70% of major pharmaceutical manufacturers in North America. The scope of the accountability initiative was staggering. The foundation would be investigating dozens of companies with combined revenues exceeding $500 billion. The environmental violations they exposed could result in regulatory changes that transformed how pharmaceutical companies operated worldwide. This is going to be the story of the century, Stephanie said with awe. This is going to be the transformation of the century, Victoria corrected. We're not just exposing environmental violations, we're proving that pharmaceutical companies can operate profitably while protecting ecological systems. Patricia Wong began packing her research materials. Robert spent his final months documenting environmental damage caused by pharmaceutical manufacturing. Now his children will spend their careers proving that pharmaceutical innovation and environmental protection can advance together. Victoria felt the weight of responsibility and the excitement of possibility combining into something that felt like destiny. Her father had trusted her with the resources to pursue environmental accountability on a scale she'd never imagined possible. Her siblings had chosen cooperation over resistance, transformation over preservation of status quo. The pharmaceutical industry was about to discover that environmental violations were no longer acceptable costs of business. "One final question," Marcus said as the meeting began to conclude. "What happens to pharmaceutical companies that refuse to cooperate with environmental accountability initiatives?" David Chen's expression became serious. Companies that refuse to achieve sustainability standards face comprehensive legal action, regulatory investigation, shareholder litigation, and public exposure of their environmental practices. And companies that cooperate? Companies that achieve environmental compliance receive financial incentives, research partnerships, regulatory benefits, and recognition as industry leaders in sustainable pharmaceutical development. Victoria gathered her copies of the foundation documents, feeling the magnitude of the transformation beginning. Tomorrow morning, the Caldwell Environmental Accountability Foundation would officially launch operations with nearly $3 billion in resources and legal authority to investigate pharmaceutical industry environmental practices worldwide. Within 6 months, pharmaceutical companies across North America would be forced to choose between achieving rigorous environmental standards or facing comprehensive accountability measures that could transform their operations permanently. "I have one request," Victoria said as her siblings prepared to leave. "Tonight, I want us to have dinner together as a family, just the 3 of us, talking about Dad's legacy and our plans for honoring his memory through environmental accountability work." Marcus nodded immediately. "I'd like that. We have a lot to discuss about foundation operations and compliance strategies." "I'd like that too," Stephanie agreed. "We need to design pharmaceutical industry engagement protocols that encourage cooperation instead of resistance." Victoria smiled, feeling family relationships healing in real time. Her father's environmental accountability initiative had accomplished something she'd never expected. It had brought his children together around shared values instead of dividing them through competition for resources. As they left the Hartwell Associates building, Victoria looked up at the Meridian Tower where the foundation would establish its headquarters. 15 floors above the conference room where she'd just inherited nearly $3 billion, environmental scientists and legal experts would soon be working together on the largest corporate accountability initiative in history. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Patricia Wong. "Robert would be so proud of his children today. You're going to change the world." Victoria replied, "We're going to prove that environmental accountability and business success can strengthen each other. Dad's pharmaceutical fortune is going to fund the transformation he dreamed of." That evening, Victoria, Marcus, and Stephanie had dinner at their father's favorite restaurant in Cherry Hills Village, discussing foundation operations and environmental compliance strategies with the enthusiasm of siblings planning the adventure of their lifetimes. They talked about sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing, regulatory reform, community remediation efforts, and the hundreds of environmental scientists and legal experts who would soon be joining their accountability initiative. They also talked about their father's transformation during his final months, his regret about environmental damage caused by pharmaceutical manufacturing, and his determination to use his wealth for ecological restoration rather than continued profit maximization. By the end of dinner, they'd outlined preliminary strategies for pharmaceutical industry engagement, environmental compliance certification, and sustainable manufacturing incentives that would guide the foundation's operations for years to come. Victoria drove home to Boulder that night, knowing that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer a nonprofit environmental activist with limited resources and minimal industry influence. She was the director of the most well-funded corporate accountability initiative in history, with siblings who'd chosen transformation over preservation and legal authority to investigate pharmaceutical industry practices worldwide. More importantly, she was Robert Caldwell's daughter, trusted with the responsibility of proving that pharmaceutical innovation and environmental protection can advance together rather than in opposition. The next morning, the Caldwell Environmental Accountability Foundation would officially begin operations with nearly $3 billion in resources and a mission to transform corporate environmental responsibility worldwide. Victoria fell asleep that night thinking about pharmaceutical executives who had no idea their environmental violations were about to be exposed by an accountability initiative with unlimited financial backing and comprehensive legal authority. The pharmaceutical industry's era of treating environmental protection as an optional business expense was about to end permanently. 3 months later, the foundation had launched environmental investigations targeting 47 pharmaceutical companies across North America. 12 companies had already achieved preliminary compliance certification and were receiving financial incentives for sustainable manufacturing practices. 8 companies were facing federal environmental charges based on violation documentation provided by the Foundation's research team. The Pharmaceutical Industry Trade Association had requested a meeting with Victoria to discuss industry-wide adoption of environmental compliance standards rather than company-by-company accountability measures. Marcus had left investment banking to become the Foundation's chief financial officer, designing innovative financing structures that made environmental compliance more profitable than regulatory violations. Stephanie had transformed her consulting business into a sustainability advisory firm that helped pharmaceutical companies achieve environmental certification while maintaining research and development capabilities. Victoria sat in her new office on the 57th floor of the Meridian Tower, reviewing progress reports from environmental investigations across 3 countries. Through her floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the Denver skyline where pharmaceutical company logos were beginning to include sustainability certifications alongside corporate branding. Her father's dream of pharmaceutical innovation advancing alongside environmental protection was becoming reality faster than anyone had expected. The pharmaceutical industry was discovering that environmental accountability strengthened rather than weakened their long-term profitability. And companies were competing to achieve sustainability standards that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Patricia Wong. "Victoria, I have news that would make your father incredibly happy. The Environmental Protection Agency wants to adopt the Foundation's compliance standards as federal regulatory requirements for pharmaceutical manufacturing." Nationwide? Worldwide. International regulatory agencies are requesting consultation on adapting our sustainability protocols for their pharmaceutical oversight programs. Victoria smiled, thinking about her father's transformation during his final months and his determination to use pharmaceutical wealth for ecological healing rather than continued ecological damage. The Caldwell Environmental Accountability Foundation had accomplished in 3 months what environmental activists had been pursuing for decades. Pharmaceutical companies were embracing sustainability standards, regulatory agencies are strengthening environmental requirements, and communities affected by pharmaceutical contamination were receiving remediation resources that would restore ecological systems permanently. Her father's pharmaceutical fortune had become the foundation for proving that environmental responsibility and business success can mutually strengthen each other rather than existing in tension. Victoria had inherited more than wealth. She'd inherited the opportunity to transform corporate environmental accountability worldwide while honoring her father's memory through the largest sustainability initiative in business history. The pharmaceutical industry would never be the same, and the planet would be healthier because Robert Caldwell had chosen environmental healing over profit maximization during the final months of his life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.